Howdy y'all, Jeremy here. There was a lot happening this week. On today's episode of Taxpayer Talks, we discuss the recent interview we had with outgoing Republican State Representative 𝗧𝗫𝗏 Biedermann and what he had to say about the political culture in the Texas House of Representatives. We also talk about some of the more interesting things to come out of the House Appropriations Committee hearing that took place on Wednesday this week, and some of the narratives that are already being set up as we approach the 88th legislative session set to begin in January. Let's get into it. Taxpayer Talks is brought to you by Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, and it's only made possible from generous donations from listeners like you. If you want to support our work, you can visit texastaxpayers.com/donate to make a tax-deductible contribution today. Thank you.
Hey everyone, how you doing? Welcome to Taxpayer Talks, the podcast where we hold Austin accountable by giving taxpayers news that affects their wallets. My name is Tim Harden, president of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. I'm here with Jeremy, our executive director. How you doing today, Jeremy?
Howdy, doing great.
Awesome. How's your week been, man? You been busy?
It's been a pretty busy week, actually, surprisingly. I mean, we're getting closer and closer to elections, right? And so obviously we'll talk about this, but we were down at the Capitol this week monitoring a hearing. And then, of course, just seeing what everyone's talking about, what issues seem to be important to taxpayers as we get up to the November election. Early voting has started, so it's been a busy week.
Yeah, I feel you. I'm kind of jet lagged today. I spent two days traveling. We went out to Cass County, Atlanta, Texas, which is almost in Louisiana, and spoke with some patriots out there. I talked about property taxes, and I got back really late Tuesday night, and then headed straight to Austin with you, and we'll see what happened to the appropriations hearing. And so I'm glad to be back home with the family. And excited, to get through this election season. This is a busy season for everyone in politics, but of course it's a crucial time. So we're hoping to make sure people get out and vote, use our index, and looking forward to the 8th to take a little breather before, of course, we start pre-filing. We'll start seeing legislation shortly thereafter. So we got season ahead of us.
If I'm being honest, I just want the political ads to stop, right?
Yeah.
So.
And the mailers, right? Yeah, I feel you. Well, hey, it's an awesome week. We have actually a lot of clips we're going to be looking at today. The first few were from a bonus episode of Taxpayer Talks we did with our new board member, 𝗧𝗫𝗏 Biedermann, current state rep. And so what we're going to do is just look at a few pieces of conversation. We'll take a look at this first clip and then kind of talk about how that interview went.
They have it all set up. Of all these things you have to spend on. And if you don't, you're a bad person. But, where does all that come from? It comes from these special interest groups and the lobby groups who are getting paid by people who want more money. And so the legislators then, and in order to appease them and of course, to be part of the club and to get more donations and to be liked, they have dinners every night and everything else they get from the lobbyists, they're going to vote for that crap. And then we continue to just grow government. So that's exactly how it works. And it's so out of control. It's hard to stop the momentum of the bureaucracy and the growth of bureaucracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That was interesting, right? I think he lets the cat out of the bag, so to speak, right? The game, if you will, is that lawmakers are incentivized, right, by the people that show up and talk to them, right? The people that donate to them. And that's lobbyists, that's special interest groups. And I think that's absolutely true. You can see that all over the state budget, especially over the last few decades, as kind of these like pet projects and stuff get put inside or requested specifically, right, for taxpayer dollars. And I think he kind of speaks to that. And, look, if taxpayers don't show up, taxpayers don't talk to their lawmakers, right, in the absence of that discussion, these folks fit the void. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important that taxpayers realize that the game is rigged against them. That is the reality of the situation. There's an army of lobbyists and special interest groups that are paid very good money to be in that Capitol and to cozy up to legislators to get their agendas done. And quite honestly, it's very apparent when you've worked in that building like we have, who they're paying more attention to. And typically they're paying more attention to the lobbyists, they're paying more attention to the special interest groups, they're paying more attention to their local political subdivision leaders, their city councils and their school boards, that's where a lot of the backroom deals happen, is with their local leaders. And so there's kind of this, hey, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. And the problem is a lot of these bad actors just continue to get reelected. That can be changed, though. Not only do taxpayers and voters need to show up at the Capitol and voice their opinions in committee hearings and showing up and getting to know their state rep, but more importantly, in campaign season, they need to get active. And if you have a bad member who's been bad for a long time, maybe he has an F on the fiscal index, what you need to do is find a quality candidate, and then everyone in that community who declares themselves to be conservative needs to put their resources behind them. That is absolutely the most effective way to clean up Austin, is simply just remove bad actors.
When I go and speak and talk to folks, right, I always try to tell them, look, if you're showing up right when the legislative session has started, you're already too late. And I don't mean that to be cynical, right? Like, you should still do that, but you should absolutely develop a relationship with your lawmaker right now, right, in the interim time, and certainly feel him out on where he's at on a lot of these issues, especially issues we talk about constantly all the time, right? We know as former legislative staff, there is no shortage of events, right? Things that you can go to that are sponsored by corporations and lobbyists and all of these things, especially during the legislative session. And those things take the attention of lawmakers and their staff away from constituents during the legislative session. So, you shouldn't be showing up during the 140-day siege on your liberty, right? By alone, right? You should absolutely do that, but you should also do it during the interim time period, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of add on the election piece, most people I talk to, there's not as much participation in the primaries in Texas. And the reality is, especially with redistricting that just happened, most of our districts are gerrymandered. And so they're either Republican or Democrat. There's very, very few competitive districts in Texas. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the primary is the election. And so people of Texas need to wake up and understand that you actually choose your representative in primary season. And so as soon as the legislative session is over, essentially primary campaigning starts, because you have less than a year once that happens. And so it's important for taxpayers and voters to understand that if after this session is over, when we come out with our index and they have a failing grade on the index because they are not supporting small government, it's time to find somebody to oust them. And it's incumbent upon voters to do that. That is the responsibility we have in our constitutional republic. So,
well, you brought up local, right, government officials showing up to the Capitol earlier, and or their lobbyists, right? As we've talked about several times. It's interesting. One of the other things, of course, that Representative Biedermann talked about in our conversation was property taxes, right? And not being prioritized by leadership necessarily. So I guess it's probably a good time. Let's get into that clip. Do you think that they, in fact, have to do something this go around, or has not enough political pressure been brought to bear, especially on Republican lawmakers?
Well, they're all going to say that, they all hear it back in their district, and in Austin, they don't talk about it. It all comes down to leadership. If governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker want to do something true about property taxes and not just increase the deduction for your homestead. I mean, what a joke. What a total slap in the face to say, oh man, we did this to help reduce your property taxes. It's a total joke. It's unbelievable, but it's not the lawmakers. That's what happened. It's really not the lawmakers. It is leadership. And if leadership wants it, just like constitutional carry, you guys were involved in constitutional carry a lot more than I was when I was there because of your bosses. And it went nowhere. And you knew it was going nowhere. You knew it had no chance. This last session, it was like, you can't stop it. It didn't matter what we did. You weren't going to stop con carry because leadership wanted it. So that's really how it is. I don't want to say it's the lawmakers that, really talk about property taxes. They can just do whatever they're told by leadership.
So yeah, he's 100% right. And this is something that we have been saying for years. Something we've known as legislative staffers being in the building is the reality is there's three main leaders in Texas. You have the Speaker of the House, who right now is Dade Phelan. You have the Lieutenant Governor, who is Dan Patrick, and you have the Governor, who is Abbott. And each one of them will have their own legislative priorities. And each chamber, Dade will have his priorities, Patrick will have his, and then Abbott will come out in the state of the state and have his legislative priorities as well. Now, I would argue that Abbott probably has the strongest. Some people would say that Dan Patrick has the strongest, but I would argue Abbott has the strongest simply because he has the ability to call special sessions, and he can call as many as he wants. And so he has the ability to put pressure on both chambers. He has the bully pulpit, and he can put out in the media, hey, listen, we're going to keep doing this until these two other guys get themselves under control. And so each one does wield power. But yes, if leadership opposes it or doesn't care about something, then it's not going to get done. And so something like property tax reform is absolutely going to have at least, I would say, two of those three behind it, if not all three, to get it accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, so the good news is, right, being cautiously optimistic that you've at least had the Lieutenant Governor opine, right, on using the budget surplus, whatever portion of it, no matter how small. And then you've, of course, had the governor talk about it using at least half, right? The supposed largest tax cut in Texas history is coming, that sort of thing. And of course, at the recent debate, as we've talked about several times, talking about actually putting us on a path to buy down school maintenance and operations portion of the property tax, right, to eliminate it. What should be highlighted, and this came up in the conversation you can see in our episode there on Friday with Representative Biedermann, is I have not seen Speaker Dade Phelan comment at all about using the budget surplus for property tax relief. In fact, there was an interim charge related to this, but it was talking about using the leftover ARPA funds, right? The funds passed by Congress. And it wasn't necessarily to use not only the $27 billion projected surplus, but any portion of that to do it. And so, it is concerning not having one leg of that quote unquote three-legged stool, right? Having not said anything about it as we approach the legislative session, which is 2 months away.
Yeah, you can get it done with 2 out of 3, and I think the perfect example, and Representative Biedermann brought this up, was it's not a secret in Austin that Dan Patrick was opposed to constitutional carry, and the word on the street is the House actually tossed it over to the Senate in hopes, knowing that he wasn't going to pass it, so they could kind of put egg on his face, right? But the reality is, we had gun groups and gun advocates blow up Dan Patrick and shut his phone lines down for nearly a week. And guess what? He conceded. That's what happens when grassroots activists and voters, pressure politicians. And so it did get passed. And so I'm not even sure Abbott was behind that. But once it got to his desk, what are you going to do? Not sign the pro-gun legislation, And so you can get this done, and there's a role everyone has to play, voters included. I think it's funny you mentioned the surplus, right? And you're right, Dade has not mentioned that. And when we were in the hearing yesterday, it was funny. I think it was Donna Howard. They were talking about this socialized broadband that we passed, and they were talking about how the guy said, the $4 billion is not going to last very long. And so then Donna Howard kind of insinuated, well, what about the surplus? Could we use some of the surplus to kind of throw at this boondoggle of a program? And it's no secret, that Dade has cozied up to Democrats. He allows Democrat chairs. He had Joe Moody, one of the most liberal Democrats, as his Speaker pro tem. And so this all has kind of got me questioning, like, does Dade even have the stomach to do any property tax reform? We'll see. We're getting really close, but it's worrisome, to say the least.
Well, it's a good segue. So obviously we spent time yesterday, right, at the House Appropriations Committee hearing. This is likely, although I don't know this for a definite, but likely the last public hearing of the House Appropriations Committee before the next legislative session. They had 3 things on the agenda. Of course, the most important for our purposes, right, was to kind of view the select testimony from the legislative appropriation requests. These are the agencies, right, right? Request whatever amount of money they want to be allocated for the next 2 fiscal years. The Legislative Budget Board packages that up nice, neatly, and then it presents that to the committee. But, along in that conversation, among some of the other things, we were talking about the broadband expansion, or, the socialized broadband, as you called it. There were some interesting exchanges, to include one that I think really kind of spoke to the heart of the issue, which is taxpayers are footing the bill to build out broadband infrastructure across the state of Texas. And there's some lawmakers, to include Representative Schaefer, you'll see here, who believe that maybe the free market could do that better. So let's watch that clip.
Does any of these monies flow to Starlink?
Starlink would need to be an applicant for that funding. So to kind of go back onto the mapping component of this as well, any ISP, the kind of carrot, the way the legislation was written, is that any ISP who doesn't submit data to the map cannot participate in the actual program itself.
So to your knowledge, they haven't so far?
They have not submitted data to us.
So the private sector has already brought broadband to my house in East Texas, where I didn't have a broadband solution. Mm-hmm. So as we keep talking about how we're just going to pour more money into this in the future, have we considered that the private sector is already doing this?
Certainly. There's certainly the private sector is already doing some things in other communities as well. But I think the idea here is to address that market failure in areas that have been neglected for a long period of time, where bringing that.
Starlink, you can be anywhere. Mm-hmm. So how is it a community that's... So you see what I'm saying is you just need a satellite receiver and Starlink subscription, and we're passing a lot of money to these companies. Maybe we could just do vouchers or something. I don't know, but I don't know, members. I mean, we're doing a lot that the private sector is already doing, in my opinion.
I do want to follow up a little bit on that, because this is actually something that offline we'd had some not you and I, but some have had conversations on, and that is that, Texas is a huge state, mm-hmm. and geographically very diverse. And so where fiber definitely has an advantage in many respects, you could have some areas in West Texas where satellite might actually make a lot more sense, mm-hmm. if you're trying to reach those people. So what have you done to contemplate that in coming up with a state plan for how you're going to cover this?
Yeah, and I completely agree. Flying out to Amarillo or any of those areas out there, you kind of look out the window and you say, how are you supposed to bring broadband to all these homes that are out here, especially, they're 2-3 miles apart from each other. The fiber only approach is, again, going to burn through that funding. To go back to the satellite component, though, within the notice of funding availability that Comptroller Hager pushed back on, NTIA looks at satellite and unlicensed spectrum wireless as unserved areas. So even if you're receiving 100 over 100 service through a Starlink satellite, but that's your only provider in that location, when this BEAD program comes online, your area is unserved, and therefore funding needs to go to that location. That's how NTIA has set up their program through the notice of funding availability. So, yes, satellite is the answer for some locations, because that's the only answer. However, following some of these federal guidelines, you're seeing, again, as they're fiber focused, they want to be seeing that build out to these locations.
That's interesting. So I appreciate that feedback. But if you truly want to cover the entire state, it seems you're going to have to consider all the available technologies, and some will make sense in some regions, and mm-hmm. a different one may make sense in a different region.
I agree.
I absolutely love this response. He's right. He's right 100%. I think I tweeted out something about Starlink as well. And the reality is, Elon Musk, bless him, he's about to close his deal on Twitter and hopefully free up that platform. He is just a renaissance man. He does all kinds of stuff. And I'm not trying to say he has no faults. He does. Right. But the reality is he's a good example of, we can say, quote unquote, free market, because he does receive some subsidies. Right. But he has been just launching thousands and thousands of satellites up to create this Starlink. which it's being pitched as. And the hope of the business model is that it will be just as fast as broadband, but you're not going to have to run, thousands, tens of thousands of miles of fiber optic cable. And it's surprising to me that legislators, well, I guess not surprising because, we had a few of them say, I'm not a very techie person, but hey, I will spend billions of dollars on an archaic technology. It's like the silliness, and so the fact that we don't see the writing on the wall and that we're already throwing $5 billion at this problem. We know this is going to take way more money than they expect. It's going to take way longer than they expect. I mean, do you really believe that we're going to finish this project of rural broadband in the next 10 years? By then, we probably have something even better than Starlink, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, so for context purposes, right? So obviously the bill that set all this up, right, passed in the regular session. And, to the chagrin of a lot of lawmakers, right, who took issue with the fact that the free market could potentially provide a better outcome here, right? But under the guise of, well, we've got to the 29 million Texans, we've got to provide broadband internet for them, right? Never mind that, like, the market chose not to, right, for whatever reasons, because maybe there wasn't a demand for it out there. The infrastructure cost too much. Really what it was a setup because they knew money was coming down the pike from the federal government, passed through the ARPA funding that we spoke about earlier, right? i.e. taxpayers have already footed this bill, right, on the national level. And so they knew this money was coming. They ended up allocating this money in the third called special legislative session. So yeah, the state of Texas is allocating the $5 billion for it or whatever. But like the reality is, or 5 million, sorry. The reality is that like there's a heck of a lot of money that's being allocated from the federal government for this, right? And ultimately what it is the government choosing winners over losers as far as what internet service providers get to build out this broadband infrastructure that they wouldn't do otherwise, right? But they get to have taxpayer money to do it, to be incentivized to do it, if you will. And so, the exchange, I think, between Schaefer and the representative from the Broadband Development Office there is absolutely kind of just highlights the overall crux of the issue,
Yeah, doesn't it make you throw up in your mouth when you say Broadband Development Office? Like, I can't believe we have an agency that is their sole focus is to run broadband and cord, right? And it is concerning. All those are concerning, and the fact that the guy from the BDO literally said we're going to blow through this $5 billion pretty fast. In other words, like we're going to spend way more money. I bet you they spend 20-30 billion before this whole thing is said and done. And it's problematic. Schaefer made many statements about government being involved in private business. He said this about EV charging stations is socialism, and we have I believe Ashby, right, in our next clip, who is talking about the need to incentivize businesses. And so let's take a look at that clip and we'll see what we think about it.
Representative Howard, you're exactly right. And I think a lot of members of the legislature, probably most members of the legislature, have done a lot of discussion and have had conversations with their constituencies back in our districts about this issue. In my area, unlike evidently my East Texas colleague here, there's a reason why especially when you look at the map, the broadband map that's been published, that East Texas, South Texas, and El Paso in particular, those areas, I mean, we have millions of Texans that have no access to internet, much less broadband. So I don't think we can just sit here and say that there's a market-based solution. There is a market-based solution, but it evidently is going to require some incentivation or some incentives. And so I think that's the whole point here, is that we need to be technology agnostic to the chairman's question, because what works in Lufkin may not work in El Paso, what may not work in Austin or Tyler. So we need to let the market decide that, and that's why I was pleased to see the Comptroller Hager pen that letter to the Texas delegation, basically asking us to do the same thing Congress asked the feds and the bureaucracy to do, which is let's let the market decide who the winners and losers are in terms of broadband providers. And so that hasn't changed. That's where we are as a state. But I think the chairman's right. It is going to take all hands on deck approach in letting our ISPs dictate the solution to this question. Because the goal here, I think, is simple. We want all 30 million Texans connected to broadband. That's the goal here. And I loved the question Chairman Bonin asked about. If you had all the money in the world, how long would it take? Because ultimately, that's where a lot of people are. Is regardless of your zip code, broadband is not a luxury. It is an essential part of our daily lives now. And just because we live out or I don't, but somebody lives out in far west Texas or on the Sabine River over close to Louisiana, they also deserve access to a quality education and prospects to make a good living and be a productive citizen. And so we as Texans, we have an opportunity to stand up and take advantage of this funding that's coming down and maybe make some strategic investments that Representative Howard was talking about next session. So anyway, I'm excited about where we're headed, and thank you for what you and your staff are doing to lead us in the right direction.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a little concerning that you have a sitting House Appropriations Committee member who's trying to define his version of free market economics that also includes, quote, incentivizing, right, companies to go out and build additional broadband services. I don't know about you, but no version of the free market that I've ever been taught, at least, has included the government being involved by, quote, incentivizing companies with taxpayer dollars. It's concerning that you have an appropriations member that doesn't seem to understand that.
Yeah, we actually give a talk on free market economics with True Texas Project, and I've done it with a few other groups as well. And we talk about the free market, and I kind of seem like we need to go give that presentation to these legislators so they can learn what the word free means, because free is void of any kind of government interference. And so to say something like we need to incentivize these businesses so the free market can work is just, it's oxymoronic. It's so dumb, and they're tone deaf as to what the deal is. But it shows, you're right, it shows where our legislators are at. I wrote an article last week, I believe, about 313s, the tax abatements, which is the largest corporate welfare program in Texas. And one of the studies that I cited in it was businesses, when they were surveyed, how many actually cared about corporate welfare when it came to determining them moving to Texas. It was 15% of businesses. And so a very small portion even considered that to be important, but yet we are willing, as our lawmakers are willing to just throw billions of dollars at businesses to quote unquote incentivize them. And I think I made the point on Twitter the other day as well, which is, the incentive is profit, and businesses, that is their motivation. A good, efficient business is going to profit. That is their incentive. And so we do not need to steal from taxpayers in order to give to businesses to increase their margins even more. It's unfair to taxpayers, and it's criminal, quite honestly.
It's the representative. It wasn't shown in this clip, but the representative from the BDO, which I hate the acronym. I hate the fact that this office exists. But this representative had one of the things he had said in this exchange was that it was market failure, right? And for those that are familiar with kind of just economic terms, one, I wholeheartedly disagree that it was market failure. It's the market choosing not to provide for something that they're not going to make a profit off of, right? There's obviously no demand for it, or the demand hasn't reached, right, the level that necessitates the market approaching it. This is a perfect example of so many other fights that take place in the legislature, right? Whether it's rural versus urban lawmakers, Republican versus Democrat, right? That sort of thing, where we are collectivizing. We're asking state taxpayers, right? Taxpayers in Houston to pay for folks way out in, let's say, Plainview, Texas or something, right? Or vice versa on things, right? When it comes to water and that sort of stuff. And it's kind of infuriating, right? That we promote ourselves as a state as this bastion of just like, we're pro-business, we're pro, free market economics. And we have so much corporate welfare in this state. We're picking winners and losers all of the time through a litany of programs. Of course, you talked about the 313 program, which is the largest in Texas, but this is just another example of where we're kind of the antithesis of the free market in a lot of ways. And you got to see that play out yesterday at the House Appropriations hearing.
Yeah, we kind of on that, there's this culture of spending, which is going to take us to our last clip here. And before we do that, I thought it was kind of awkward. We both kind of looked at each other. Representative, was it Wilson, right? This was when they transitioned to LBB. He was giving some updates on legislative appropriation requests, basically, how much money we're going to give certain state agencies. And there's this awkward moment where Wilson's like, "What? Why are we doing this? How is this helpful?" And like everybody's just kind of really quiet. And then I guess Bonin kind of chimed in and basically says, we have to do this. It's according to the rules. And it was just this really awkward moment. But after we got past that, there's a couple of really good questions asked to the LBB. One of them involved the growth of these requests. So let's watch the clip real quick, and then we can discuss it.
Is there a way for you to make this information digestible for us so that you take what we appropriated for all these agencies last session and what they asked for in these LARs and these exceptional items, and you tell me what the growth is?
Oh, yes, sir. In fact, interesting you asked that, because I was doing that in the back room just a little bit ago. So the 22-23 GR base that was in your last General Appropriations Act was about $120 billion, roughly. This $15 billion added on top of that. In other words, if you added all this to it, it's about a 13.1% increase.
Okay. So a 13% increase in state spending is what our agencies are asking for writ large?
If you funded all these exceptional items as written. And again, just to make a point, these are just the agencies above $40 million in appropriations. Of course, those not included here are relatively small.
Got it.
If I can add one caveat to that as well, the 13.1% is the exceptional item total that Aaron had referenced earlier, the 15.6. There are several agencies, specifically TEA and Health and Human Services, who put in placeholder items just to keep the conversation moving. For example, TEA had an item for educator staffing, but they just put it like a blank. It was like $2 or something, just to consider the conversation. Medicaid cost rates, cost increases will be another thing that was a placeholder. So that's not in that 15.6 that we referenced earlier. But if you look specifically at those items, you'll see that we highlighted those as sort of placeholders by the agencies.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? I mean, this is obviously a question that we had, and Representative Schaefer asked this question in this exchange, which is, like, what is going to be the difference from what we appropriated last time to this time, right? What are these agencies asking for? And over 13% is not a small chunk of change, right? I'd like to know, did my wallet did I make 13% more as a taxpayer since 2 years ago? I don't think so, right? In fact, if anything, I'm making less because of inflation and everything else. And so this moment speaks to, I think it really sets the stage for this next legislative session where you're going to have a bunch of lawmakers, appropriators, right, on the House Appropriations and Senate Finance Committee, kind of probably just go along with whatever the agencies are asking for, right, without giving a second thought to, well, maybe instead of doing this, we should also tighten our belts, right? Yeah,
there was a lot of showing of the cards in the hand. I always like to use that phrase. The Senate does it a lot. They kind of stumble over their words and kind of let us know where they're headed. And there was a number of different representatives who commented. I think Gonzalez commented that we're at the lowest legislative staffer in Texas history. I don't know if that's true or not, but this is what she said. And of course, in my head, I'm like, yes, good, less. But her insinuation was, we need more bureaucrats, right? I think there was someone quoted how big inflation was since 2015, and it was something insane like 27%, which is crazy, right? And they're going to use this as justification. to grow state agencies. But we, in our Texas Prosperity Plan, have operated under the premise that government is already too big. And so I don't really care how much inflation is. Our government is far, far too big. Like literally we could chop it in half and it would probably still be too big. We have a $260 billion biennial budget. And, you know, based on conservative metrics and essentially this idea of, you know, the conservative Texas budget that TPPF has promoted as well as us in the past, with inflation as high as it is, we're probably going to be around 15% for a spending cap, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so I think TPPF has released their new report yesterday where they're going to be asking. So it'll be interesting to see what they recommend, if they think that will actually be conservative or not. I can tell you right now, TFR does not think that is going to be conservative. We're advocating for a freeze on the budget, and it needs to stop. And this clip is a perfect example. This legislative action, appropriation request by the LB was just a select few agencies. I think it was like education and something else. And so they're already showing their hand and saying, listen, we're going to grow these 13%, and that's not going to count all of the people who try and tack on amendments and get more money for all of these other agencies, or give raises to legislative staff or any state staff. And so I think we're in for a big one. We're going to grow our budget very, very big if we do not step up and demand otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things at play here, right? Absolutely, wholeheartedly agree that taxpayers should be concerned, not only because we're going into a legislative session where they're setting the narrative, right, that we need to increase spending on things, but that they've also got a $27 billion surplus to play with, right? And as we've talked about several times, that surplus represents an over collection of tax money already, right, from taxpayers. That meaning they didn't need it, right, from the past biennium. So we shouldn't just give them free license to spend that, right, on top of whatever it is that they're going to set the narrative for that necessitates spending this go around. The other thing that, and we kind of spoke to this, right, when you were talking about Representative Mary Gonzalez in her moment talking about we're at the least amount of state employees, right, is that it speaks to kind of where this weird dynamic where they always look back and make this kind of assumption, this silent assumption that the last budget we passed was perfect, right? Like that was the perfect size of government. So we need, because Texas's population has grown, we need to grow the budget, right? And we take a completely different approach to that. We think government was already, it's too big now. It was already too big. And so if anything, we need to get back to, right, a budget that actually addresses the kind of the current size and scope that Texas is in. And we've been decades away from that. That sort of thing. And I think that really speaks to the interesting kind of disagreement, if you will, on how we budget as a state. And it's concerning that lawmakers are they're so close-minded on the timeline to only think in 2-year increments.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't care less how much our population has grown. That's not even a metric that comes into my mind when we're talking about the size and scope of government. It is, have you ever heard anybody say, no, the government is not too big when we're out talking to conservatives? Of course not. Everyone thinks the government is too big, certainly the federal government, but the state government as well. And the fact that it is already too big tells us that we need to restrain it and actually cut it. I mean, a freeze is a good option. That's what we want to start with. But the reality is we need to shrink the size of government. And one of the main reasons is, when government grows, it never seems to shrink. It only gets bigger and bigger. And this causes problems like, for instance, Ashby's remarks, right? That things like government incentives, you have billions and billions of taxpayer dollars, and then you hire all these people, all these bureaucrats, you have incomes dependent on the government now. And so it's very hard to slash government and just fire thousands of people and say, well, what, we have all these billions of dollars that we can create public-private partnerships with and stimulate the economy. And so it's this Leviathan, right, as Hobbes says. It just doesn't ever seem to shrink. And so we have to realize that it is already too big, and it's going to take a massive amount of effort to restrain the size and scope of Texas government. And I think a very practical first step is just stopping it in its tracks. And if inflation is great, well, that's fine. Let's operate within what we have right now. And if we have surpluses or we increase the surplus, we will simply give that back to taxpayers in the form of things like property tax elimination.
Definitely agree. I mean, the fact that the first thought from lawmakers isn't to return not only the $27 billion projected surplus back to taxpayers, but also like we understand taxpayers that you are hurting, right? Likely because of issues caused by government, right? Not only government spending, but obviously the Federal Reserve and everything else. If their first thought is to not return, right, that money and then also, right, limit the amount that they're spending because they're not a for-profit entity. They literally make money or get money from taxpayers. We should be concerned. And that should be what we're striving for, right? Is making that their top priority.
Amen. Well, that is all the time we have today on the Taxpayer Talks. Enjoyed talking with Jeremy. We want to remind everybody that we are in early voting right now. Election day is November 8th, not next Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that. So get out and vote. Vote for fiscal conservatives that are going to restrain the size and scope of our government. And of course, we will see y'all next Thursday. Thank you very much for being with us. Look out for that bonus episode tomorrow morning.
For even more content, follow us on social media at Texas Taxpayers on Facebook and Instagram, at Texas_taxpayers on Twitter. Subscribe to the Fiscal Note, our weekly email jam-packed full of information important to Texas taxpayers at texastaxpayers.com/subscribe. And then make sure to check out our Texas Prosperity Plan, texastaxpayers.com/TPP. Thanks. Hey, you made it to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so that way you're notified next time we post a video and update to the channel. Thanks again.